Ava Daniels is a black congresswoman and former civil rights attorney. She walked into a Charleston courtroom expecting a hearing, but walked into history. In front of reporters, lawyers, and a stunned public, she was slapped across the face by a decorated police officer, Logan Reed. The room froze, but Ava didn't. She chose not to fight back with fury, but with facts. That moment sparked a storm as Ava began to uncover what the system tried to bury. Fake reports, hidden abuse, silent complicity, powerful names started to fall. A police chief forced to resign, dozens of cases reopened, laws rewritten in her name. But the real impact? Thousands inspired to rise with her. This is the story of how one act of violence became the crack that split an entire institution wide open. And now we ask you, what would you do if justice was on trial in your city? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to share where you're watching from. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. The sound of the slap hit harder than any gavel ever could. It echoed through the marble walls of the Charleston courthouse with the kind of weight that made people stop breathing. Ava Daniels didn't flinch. She didn't touch her face. She didn't speak. She just stood there, still, tall, composed, while the sting of Officer Logan Reed's palm burned red across her cheek. The courtroom had gone dead silent. The judge's mouth hung open, frozen mid-sentence. A lawyer dropped her file. No one moved. No one knew how. It wasn't just a slap, it was a shock wave. You don't slap a sitting congresswoman in the middle of a courtroom. You don't slap a black woman in front of a judge and expect the world to keep turning like it's a Tuesday. But that's exactly what happened. Reed, tall, decorated, an officer with nearly 2 decades on the force, hadn't said a word before doing it. No warning, no build-up, just raw, entitled rage. Thrown across a room and onto Ava's skin like he owned the air she breathed. And still, she didn't react. She didn't give him what he expected. Anger, fear, a retaliatory outburst he could spin to his advantage. She gave him silence. The kind of silence that turns power inside out. The kind that makes guilt louder than any defense. Her eyes never left his. She stood calm, centered, like the eye of a storm that was about to rip the roof off everything this city had ever tried to cover up. The courtroom held its breath. Reporters, witnesses, legal aides, they all sat still, transfixed by the impossible thing they had just seen. A black congresswoman assaulted by a white officer in plain view, and not a single person intervened. Not the judge, not the bailiff, not even the people who claimed to fight for justice when the cameras were on. Ava had walked into this courtroom as an observer. She wasn't presiding, she wasn't prosecuting, she wasn't there to deliver a verdict. She came to witness a single hearing involving the wrongful arrest of a teenage boy. Just one of many faces crushed beneath the boot of Charleston's spotless facade. But now, with one slap, she had become the story. The judge finally spoke, or tried to. His voice cracked once, then twice. Logan Reed stood straighter, defiant, as if daring someone to challenge what he had just done. But his eyes betrayed him. They darted too quickly. They searched for approval and found none. Even his allies in the room stared through him like he was radioactive. Ava still hadn't said a word. She didn't need to. In the silence, she had seized control of the entire courtroom. Her composure was louder than any protest. Her stillness more cutting than any accusation. Logan's breathing grew shallow. He clenched his jaw. But something inside him had already cracked. Because in that moment, he understood. He hadn't silenced her. He'd just handed her the microphone. Ava adjusted the collar of her jacket, not to fix it, but to remind him she was unshaken. The redness on her cheek wasn't shame, it was a mark of defiance. Everyone saw it. Everyone would remember it. And no one could pretend it didn't happen. Cameras may not have been allowed in this hearing, but there were too many witnesses. Too many cell phones. Too many mouths ready to turn this into wildfire. Logan stepped back slightly, a twitch of uncertainty on his face. But it was too late. The moment belonged to Ava now, and she wasn't going to waste it. 1 foot forward, deliberate, grounded. She didn't flinch when the bailiff finally moved in her direction, not to assist her but to gauge what the hell was going to happen next. Everyone waited for Ava to explode, to press charges, to demand his badge. But she did something worse. She held the silence just a few seconds longer, made every person in that room feel it like a weight on their shoulders. And then she said just 2 words, "Not yet." That was it. 2 syllables that held the promise of consequence, of unraveling, of reckoning. She didn't need to shout. The room would do the shouting for her. People would ask, why did he do it? Why would a veteran officer strike a congresswoman in a courthouse? What could she have possibly said or done to justify that kind of reaction? But the questions would only expose the rot, because Ava Daniels hadn't done anything. She had stood silently at the back of a courtroom, daring to be present. That was enough to provoke a man who had never been told no, never been held accountable, never believed that someone like her could stand eye to eye with him and not blink. The courtroom didn't return to order. It couldn't. A slap like that doesn't reset. It lingers. It infects. And it forces everyone to decide which side of silence they want to stand on. Ava turned toward the bench, her eyes passing over every face, every ally in hiding, every enemy in denial. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She waited, because the storm was coming and she was going to be the one holding the thunder. But how could an officer dare do that in court? Everything started just a few days before. Ava Daniels didn't enter politics to play safe. She had never been one to stay silent, not when silence meant surrendering lives to the jaws of a system designed to erase them. Before Congress knew her as the relentless voice in hearings, before the news headlines called her fearless, she was a civil rights attorney with a fire in her gut and a personal history carved by tragedy. Years ago, long before she stood in courtrooms as a public figure, she had stood outside one as a grieving sister. Her brother, Marcus Daniels, 17 years old and walking home from work, had been stopped, beaten, and left in a coma by 2 officers who claimed he fit the description. He died 3 days later. There were investigations, empty apologies, and one officer put on paid leave. No convictions, no justice. Ava had stood in front of microphones back then too, but no one had listened. Not really. That silence became fuel. She went to law school. She didn't study to pass exams. She studied to dismantle excuses. Ava took on impossible cases, the ones no one wanted because the odds were rigged. She lost more than she won in the early years, but she earned something else, a reputation for showing up when no one else would. That reputation followed her to Congress. Charleston wasn't part of her district. She had no political obligation to be there. But when word reached her about a teenage boy being held without formal charges, her instincts kicked in. The story was too familiar. A 15-year-old named Elijah Price had been arrested outside a corner store on suspicion of vandalism. No video evidence, no eyewitnesses, just a broken window and a black kid in the wrong place. Local activists were raising hell, but the system was moving in silence. What made the case more disturbing was how fast the court scheduled a closed preliminary hearing. No public notice, no press allowed, no clear paper trail. Ava caught wind of it through an old friend who worked with a grassroots organization in Charleston. "They're trying to bury this one," the friend had told her, and fast. Ava didn't hesitate. She rerouted her schedule, canceled appearances, and landed in Charleston 2 days later. She wasn't coming as a politician. She came as a witness, a legal mind, and, if needed, a problem. From the moment she stepped into the courthouse that morning, she sensed it. The discomfort, the side eyes, the undercurrent of unease. She wasn't in her jurisdiction, but she didn't need to be. Justice doesn't draw district lines. She showed up in a gray jacket, black slacks, and no entourage. No press release, no camera crew. Just her and a folder of background research on Elijah's case. She'd spent the flight reading everything she could. The officer's report, the inconsistencies in the timestamps, the lack of formal representation for the boy, and the unspoken truth that this wasn't about vandalism, it was about control. Her plan was simple: sit in, observe, and if anything felt off, speak out. She never got that far. The hearing hadn't even officially started when she felt the first wall go up. The clerk hesitated when she asked for seating. The bailiff gave her a long, measuring look. She wasn't wearing her congressional pin. She rarely did. She preferred being underestimated. It made the truth hit harder. Once she was inside the courtroom, she spotted Elijah through the window of a side holding room. He was small for his age, wearing an oversized hoodie and handcuffs that hung awkwardly from his wrists. No parents in sight, no lawyer yet, just a boy waiting to be processed through the same system that had swallowed thousands before him. Ava's heart clenched, but her face didn't flinch. This was why she came. She took a seat quietly, 2 rows from the front. That's when she noticed him. Officer Logan Reed, already inside, standing near the prosecutor's table, talking in hushed tones with the court's legal staff. She didn't recognize him at first. Just another tall man in uniform, stiff posture, confident gait. But the look he gave her the moment their eyes met, not interest, not curiosity, threat. It was a flash of something unspoken. You don't belong here. Ava didn't look away, not then, not ever. It wasn't until later she would learn exactly who Logan Reed was. For now, all she knew was that he was the arresting officer in Elijah's case, and that something about him felt off. His body language was too sure. His hands never still, always adjusting, organizing, controlling. He glanced at her again and again as the room filled. Something in his demeanor tightened every time he looked her way. But Ava had seen men like him before. Officers who walked into rooms like they owned them, who wore their uniforms like shields against scrutiny. She'd argued cases against them. She'd watched them perjure themselves, falsify reports, and walk out clean. But this time, she wasn't in court to cross-examine anyone. She was just there to observe, or so she thought, because nothing about this morning would go as planned. This wouldn't be a standard hearing. It wouldn't be a quiet observation. And Logan Reed wouldn't turn out to be just another name in a flawed report. He was something else entirely. Something deeper, something older, something rotten. But Ava didn't know that yet. She only knew that she had come to Charleston for a boy. She just didn't know she was about to confront a symbol of everything she'd fought her whole life to destroy. Because the man she was about to face wasn't just an officer. He was the face of a system designed to crush people like her. But she didn't know. Not yet. Not until it was too late. Not until it exploded in front of the entire courtroom. Not until everything came undone. But she would. And when she did, she wouldn't back down. Because Ava Daniels didn't come to Charleston to make peace. She came carrying fire. But she didn't know the man she was about to confront wasn't just an officer. He was the embodiment of a corrupted power structure rotting from the inside out. Logan Reed was the kind of officer the city loved to display, but never dared to examine. With 2 decades on the Charleston police force, his record read like a polished resume. Commendations, awards, letters of praise from community groups he never once attended. He was the face on recruitment posters, the quote in op-eds about law and order, the man shaking hands at charity banquets in uniform, while his eyes scanned every exit. But behind the smiles and citations was something colder, sharper, more calculated. Logan didn't just serve the system, he understood how to use it. He was a master of paperwork, of language that blurred lines and shielded actions. He knew which supervisors would look the other way, which prosecutors would never push back, and how to craft reports that erased truth and replaced it with just enough plausible detail to avoid suspicion. His arrests were often clean on paper, but on the street they carried bruises and silence. Complaints against him existed, of course, but they died fast. Internal reviews marked them as unsubstantiated. Victims disappeared from public records or were discredited before their voices could reach the surface. He knew the right people to call, the right pressure points to push. He didn't need threats, just implications. Everything about Logan was curated to look unimpeachable. He walked like a man who'd never lost a case, never faced discipline, never once had to explain himself to anyone who mattered. And that's because he didn't. Logan had protectors in every corner of the justice system. Chief Richard Nolan, his direct superior, had mentored him since year one. Nolan once said in a closed-door meeting, "Logan understands the job better than anyone. He gets results without bringing heat." That was code for one thing. He knew how to keep the machine running while making the mess disappear. Judges gave Logan the benefit of the doubt, even when testimonies conflicted. DAs preferred his cases because they were airtight and clean, terms used by people who never asked where the confessions came from or how the evidence landed exactly where it needed to. Logan wasn't careless. He didn't leave trails. He left just enough truth to hide his lies, just enough procedure to mask his manipulation. If he needed a suspect to cooperate, he didn't use force in public. He used isolation, fatigue, fear, tools no body cam could capture. If something went wrong, he was always 3 steps removed from direct blame. Other officers respected him, but not because they liked him. They respected the system that armored him. They knew he wasn't invincible because he was smart. He was untouchable because the people above him needed someone like him. He did the jobs no one wanted to do, and he did them without getting caught. In return, they kept the scrutiny off his back, and Logan knew the game. He played it better than anyone. His only real weakness was arrogance, the quiet belief that he could outmaneuver anyone, that no one could touch him if he stuck to the formula. And for years, that belief held true, until the day she walked in. Logan noticed her the second she entered the courtroom, not because she made a scene, but because she didn't. She had presence, control, something precise about the way she moved and watched the room. He didn't know her name at first, but his gut reacted before his brain did. There was something about her that unsettled him. Not fear. Logan didn't scare easily, but alertness, the way a predator feels when something shifts in the environment. He asked a clerk who she was. The answer was short. Ava Daniels, Congresswoman, former civil rights attorney, known to be persistent. Logan didn't show a reaction. He didn't have to, but inside a thread pulled taut. He'd dealt with lawyers before, activists, protesters, but not like this. Not someone who came with no cameras, no headlines, just eyes that missed nothing. He felt her watching him even when she didn't move. Felt the judgment not of outrage but of calculation. He didn't like it, and he didn't know why. He told himself it was fine. She didn't have jurisdiction here. She was just another outsider trying to make noise in a city that didn't care. Charleston was built to protect people like him. It had layers of defense. Legal, political, cultural. He didn't need to worry. Still, something lingered. Because Logan Reed, who had spent his entire career spotting threats before they emerged, knew one when he saw it. And Ava Daniels didn't come to that courtroom to watch. She came to challenge. He saw it in her posture, her stillness, the way she didn't shrink when people gave her cold looks. She didn't act like someone visiting a place. She acted like someone preparing to dismantle it. It made him uneasy. And Logan hated feeling uneasy because every time he had ever ignored that feeling, someone got too close. But he still believed he could control it, control her. He had done it before, with others. Why would this be different? He didn't know yet, but he would, very soon. And when it happened, when things spiraled faster than he could manage, it would be because Logan Reed, Mr. Untouchable, had finally met the one person in the room who wasn't afraid to pull off his mask and show the rot underneath. And Logan, the man who always operated in shadows, had just seen the outline of a real enemy. Ava Daniels entered the courtroom with no fanfare, no security detail, no press badge hanging from her collar. Her outfit was plain, gray blazer, black slacks, flats with worn soles. No congressional pin, no nameplate, no symbol of the office she held. And yet, the moment she stepped through the doors, something shifted in the air. It wasn't dramatic, it was subtle, like a temperature drop before a storm. The chatter near the benches quieted, heads turned with the kind of awareness that couldn't be explained, only felt. She walked slowly, deliberately, her eyes scanning the room without hesitation or rush. People looked at her the way they look at someone they're not sure whether to underestimate or fear. She gave them no cues, no smiles, no signs of recognition. She simply moved with purpose as though the room had been waiting for her before it even knew she was coming. There was nothing loud about Ava, but the weight she carried entered first. Her presence challenged hierarchy without a single word. She wasn't there to perform, and that made people nervous. She sat 3 rows behind the prosecution's table, her hands resting lightly on a thin folder. Nothing about her posture was confrontational, but it was undeniable. This was not a woman who blended into the background. She saw everything, and people felt it. Logan Reed clocked her the moment she entered. He was talking to the lead prosecutor, but his words faltered when Ava moved into view. He masked the lapse by fidgeting with his cuffs, repositioning his stance, but something in him had already snapped into alert mode. His eyes darted to her, then back to his conversation, but the effect lingered. She wasn't doing anything, just sitting, observing, but the way she did it peeled layers off the room. Others noticed too. The judge glanced her way twice, unsure whether he recognized her. The court clerk whispered to a colleague, who whispered to another. They all wondered the same thing. Who is she? She wasn't on the docket. She wasn't announced. But the way she sat said she belonged there more than anyone else in the room. It wasn't arrogance. It was certainty. Ava's eyes never moved in haste. She didn't scan. She locked. One by one, she made quiet contact with the people around her. Not long. Just enough for them to realize they were being seen. Not as court personnel, not as functionaries, but as players on a board she had already studied. That made them uncomfortable. They adjusted papers that didn't need adjusting, rechecked mics that were already on. Logan found himself glancing at her again. She met his gaze this time, held it. His posture tensed, then straightened. He was used to people looking away first. Ava didn't. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. She looked at him like she was reading his intentions before he even acted on them. It was the kind of look that could strip the shine off a badge. She saw through things. That's what unnerved him. The moment broke when the judge called the court to order. Logan turned his attention back to the table, but the image of her eyes lingered in his periphery. Ava sat motionless, but everything about her said, "I'm here for a reason, and you're going to find out what it is." The court's opening formalities felt longer than usual. The prosecutor read charges with a tone that lacked conviction. The defense attorney seemed preoccupied, glancing behind him more than at his client. Even the bailiff shifted on his feet. Ava had said nothing, but the room was responding to her. She had inserted presence into a place built on procedure. People didn't know how to adjust. That was the power of watching without speaking. She was under no obligation to act, yet. But by simply being there, she had upset the rhythm. Logan turned back once more, expecting her to be staring at someone else by now. She wasn't. She was still watching him, and this time she narrowed her gaze ever so slightly. Not a glare, something more surgical. She wasn't angry. She was interested. Logan broke eye contact first. That had never happened before. He didn't like how it felt. The judge began to address a preliminary motion. The attorneys responded in legalese, words Ava already knew wouldn't matter. This case was already cracked. It just hadn't bled yet. The boy, Elijah Price, had been escorted into the room moments earlier. He sat in silence, his hands cuffed, his eyes flicking nervously toward the doors. Ava watched him too, but briefly. Her focus remained on the man who had put him there, and Logan knew it. His ears burned, his jaw clenched. He told himself she was just posturing. She couldn't possibly know enough to matter, but something in her stillness ate at him. Something about her made the room feel smaller. He tried to ignore it. He'd done worse to people with stronger voices, but Ava hadn't said anything yet, and that made her more dangerous than anyone who had ever raised their voice. The judge called for order again, this time louder, breaking the rising tension that had no name but plenty of substance. Logan took a sip of water. His hand trembled slightly. Ava didn't move. She didn't need to, because in that moment, without standing or speaking, she had pulled back a curtain. Everyone could feel it. The roles people played in that room, officer, judge, clerk, had been drawn into question without a single word of protest, all because she watched, all because she was present. That's when Logan made a choice, a snap decision, one he would come to regret. He turned around, took 3 steps toward Ava's row, and reached across the divide of the courtroom, and just like that, one action from Logan shattered every mask in the room. Logan Reed didn't think. He reacted. The courtroom hadn't even caught its rhythm when his hand lashed out across Ava Daniels' face with a force born not of logic but of instinct, the kind bred in years of unchecked authority. His palm connected with a sharp crack, louder than the judge's gavel, louder than any voice dared to be in that moment. The slap wasn't planned, it wasn't rational, but it was deliberate. He did it because her presence offended him. He did because, with her presence, offended him, because she sat where she wasn't supposed to, looked at him like he was something beneath scrutiny, stood as if this place, this system, belonged to her just as much as it did to him. It was a response rooted in the core of men like Logan, the kind who believed power meant ownership, and ownership meant exclusion. And Ava, quiet and unwavering, had violated that unspoken boundary. The room went completely still. It wasn't just shock, it was rupture. An invisible line had been crossed, and every person present knew it. This wasn't a heated exchange. There'd been no raised voices, no physical threat. It was one person existing in a space where another believed she didn't belong, and that belief had turned into violence. The slap was a statement, not a mistake. It said, "Stay in your place." It said, "We still control this." But it did the opposite. It exposed everything. For a second, Logan stood with his hand still out, his brain catching up to his body, his pulse outpacing his thoughts. Ava didn't move. Her cheek bore the mark, but her expression remained unreadable. No shock, no pain, just something still and bottomless. The judge stared, mouth slightly open. The bailiff froze. The attorneys looked away. Every breath in the room got caught somewhere between outrage and disbelief. But it wasn't the act that unsettled them the most. It was what came next. Or rather, what didn't. Ava didn't speak. She didn't recoil. She didn't even raise her hand to her cheek. Instead, she looked at Logan with a gaze that made his stomach twist. There was no panic in her eyes, no fear, not even anger, just recognition. And that terrified him more than any threat could, because Ava Daniels saw him. Not the badge, not the performance. She saw what he really was, and now so did everyone else. The power in the room shifted, fast and hard. What had moments before been a space governed by routine and hierarchy had suddenly cracked open, exposing its raw underbelly. Racism, abuse, complicity. The slap wasn't just a burst of violence. It was an unmasking, and the people in the room, judges, clerks, lawyers, officers, they weren't spectators anymore. They were part of it, complicit in the silence that had allowed someone like Logan Reed to believe he could do this without consequence. Reporters at the back stopped writing and simply stared. One camera phone, hidden behind a purse, captured the entire moment with shaking hands. The court stenographer's fingers hovered above the keys, frozen in place. Even Elijah Price, still handcuffed and seated on the far side of the room, stared at Ava like he was seeing the truth about the world in real time. The slap carried more than skin-deep harm. It told a story. It screamed of entitlement and the weaponization of uniform, and it rang louder than any speech ever could. It became a symbol, the moment it happened, of everything wrong with the justice system, of how fast control can turn to violence when challenged by dignity. It didn't matter that Ava was a congresswoman. Logan didn't see that. He saw what the system had taught him to see, a black woman who didn't know her place. And when she didn't flinch, didn't react the way he'd come to expect, his brain short-circuited. The real danger of that moment wasn't the act of striking her. It was the realization that his power didn't land the way it used to. Ava's stillness was louder than his violence. The courtroom didn't know what to do. Procedure had no protocol for this. There were no guidelines for what to say when the person sworn to protect order assaulted someone in front of a judge. And yet, no one moved, because that silence was older than the SLAP. It had been there for decades, sitting quietly in pews, hiding behind due process. Logan finally dropped his arm, realizing it was still halfway raised. His eyes met Ava's again, and this time he saw something different. Resolution. Not rage, not retaliation, just certainty. He stepped back, unsure for the first time in years. He felt exposed, like his uniform had turned to glass. Ava remained still. Everyone watched her, waiting, expecting her to stand up, to explode, to call for security or storm out in fury. But she didn't, and that made the moment even more terrifying, because in that courtroom full of officials trained to assert control, she was now the one everyone followed. She wasn't a judge. She wasn't an officer. She didn't have a robe or a badge. But in that moment, she owned the room. And Logan, despite all his muscle and backing, felt small. The slap echoed not just on her skin, but in every part of the room that once felt untouchable. It revealed the invisible violence beneath the surface, the kind carried out in assumptions, in glares, in unchecked decisions signed behind closed doors. And now it had a face. His. Ava's gaze never dropped. She didn't offer words of comfort to anyone watching. She didn't seek sympathy. She gave nothing away. Just silence. The kind that forces everyone else to confront what just happened. Because her silence wasn't surrender. It was a strategy. And Logan, in trying to silence her, had given her the stage. The courtroom had just watched a line be crossed, and no one could pretend it hadn't happened. No one could claim neutrality, because that slap had forced a choice: speak up or stay part of the problem. But Ava didn't wait for them to choose. She stood in her own truth, and in doing so, turned the tables in ways Logan would never recover from. While everyone expected Ava to respond, she chose the most terrifying response of all: silence. Ava Daniels stood in the dead center of chaos and didn't say a word. Not to the judge, not to the bailiff, not to Logan Reed, and not to the courtroom that had just witnessed what none of them would ever be able to explain away. Her silence was not hesitation, it was pressure. The kind that sits heavy on the chest, like the moment before an explosion, when you know something is about to blow, but you don't know when or how. She stood there, motionless, like the eye of a storm that refused to move until everything around it collapsed under its own weight. Logan kept his distance, but he could feel her gaze crawling across his skin. Not burning, not judging, just knowing. She didn't need to shout to draw attention. She already had it. Every lawyer, every assistant, every staffer, every guard. Each one of them watched her, waiting for the thing they could classify, could label, could control, but she gave them nothing, and that terrified them. She scanned the room without turning her head, taking in every single person who had chosen silence when it mattered. She committed them to memory. The clerk who looked down at his lap, the bailiff who took a step back instead of forward, the judge whose hands had tightened into fists on the bench but never lifted to stop the slap. They all sat inside a justice system built on decorum and authority, and not one of them had moved to defend her. That truth didn't enrage Ava. It sharpened her focus. She stood still long enough for the tension to stop simmering and start boiling. Her silence became the only sound in the room, louder than any gavel, more deafening than any protest. The reporters weren't typing, they were watching. The guards weren't posturing, they were waiting. And Logan was unraveling. He had expected a confrontation. He'd dealt with angry people before, yelling, screaming, accusations flying. That was a script he knew how to control. But this absolute restraint, left him no path to justify, no excuse to lean on. He had exposed himself, and Ava was holding up the mirror without saying a single thing. The pressure he felt wasn't coming from her, it was coming from within, and that made it worse. He shifted his weight. He looked around the room for someone to intervene, to say something, to bring the moment back to order, but no one moved. Ava's silence had turned every authority figure in the room into an accessory. Their inaction wasn't just weakness anymore, it was participation. She was still standing in the same spot, not because she was stunned, but because she was choosing to hold that space, own it, and make everyone live inside the discomfort of what had just happened. That kind of silence is strategic. It's not absence, it's provocation. Logan started to feel exposed in ways he couldn't describe. The uniform on his back, once a shield, now felt like a target. The badge that had always been his protection now felt like evidence. His heartbeat pounded against his chest like it wanted out. But Ava didn't flinch. Her stillness was a slow, precise message written in bold print across the room. I see you. I see what you did. I see what you allowed. I see who you are. And everyone else saw it too. The air thickened. It wasn't just tense, it was shifting. People's eyes began to flicker, uncertain, looking around to see if anyone else would break first. A single cough from the back jolted the silence, but it didn't last. Ava still hadn't spoken. She hadn't even changed her stance, but the courtroom had already started to fracture under the weight of her stillness. She wasn't just pointing at Logan, she was pointing at the room itself. At every system, every rule, every blind eye that had enabled this moment, and no one could escape it. Logan stepped back again, this time out of reflex. He realized then that he had no plan for what would come next. He had always relied on silence to protect him, but now that silence was hers, and it was working against him. Ava looked once more at the judge. Their eyes met. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His silence had already spoken volumes. He knew it. She knew it. Everyone in that room did. Ava's restraint had become a weapon none of them had prepared for, and it was cutting clean. Still without a word, she adjusted her stance, not to flee, not to fight, but to root herself deeper into the floor. Logan's breath caught in his throat. Something primal inside him knew what that meant. She wasn't done. She hadn't even started. The courtroom, once a place of procedure and order, had become a vacuum. The old rules no longer applied. Ava wasn't just challenging one man's actions. She was forcing the entire system to look at itself in the mirror she now held steady and unwavering. And it was all happening without a single outburst. Just silence. Crushing, undeniable silence. A silence that dared everyone present to speak up, to confront what had just happened, or to live with the shame of having done nothing. And Ava, still as stone, knew exactly what she was doing. She was laying a trap, not for revenge, for truth. She let the room sit in its guilt, let it marinate in its complicity. Then she blinked once, slowly, deliberately, as if to signal the clock had started. Logan turned his head, but the damage was done. The moment was immortal now. Ava had flipped the power dynamic without lifting a finger. That's when she moved, just one step forward, a pivot, not toward Logan, toward the bench. The whole room followed the motion like it was choreography they'd never rehearsed. She took another step, calm, measured, and then another. And just like that, Ava Daniels crossed the floor, not to react, not to retreat, but to launch the real fight. She didn't raise a fist. She didn't demand justice. She walked straight into the heart of the system and began her counterattack not with a punch, but with the truth. Ava Daniels didn't need to raise her voice or bang on any doors. She knew how the system worked, its routines, its loopholes, and most importantly, where the dirt was usually buried. After stepping away from the courtroom floor, she didn't waste a minute. Within the hour, she filed a formal motion demanding the release of all documents and video evidence related to the arrest of Elijah Price. Arrest reports, officer statements, body cam footage, booking logs. She wanted everything, not summaries or filtered data, but the raw material. She knew better than to trust what appeared in official reports. Too often, the truth had already been scrubbed clean before it ever saw daylight. And she had a hunch. Something about the way Logan Reed stood in that courtroom, the stiffness in his stance, the over-preparedness of the prosecutor, The unusual quiet in the defense counsel suggested this case wasn't just flawed, it was rigged. The files arrived in chunks, incomplete at first, as if the clerks assumed she wouldn't notice. But Ava did. She followed every timestamp, every log entry, every note left in margins that weren't supposed to be there. She found inconsistencies within the first hour. The arrest time on Logan's report didn't match the entry log at the precinct. The body cam video had a 6-minute gap, conveniently blacked out with a technical error note. The witness statements, supposedly from shop owners who reported the vandalism, were unsigned. Worse, the video footage from the store's own security cameras hadn't been requested or logged by the responding officers. Ava pushed harder. She called in her legal team from D.C., the ones who specialized in civil rights violations and forensic record analysis. They pulled digital signatures, cross-referenced badge activity from the night of the arrest, and uncovered that Logan hadn't even been dispatched to that location originally. He rerouted himself mid-shift. No incident number had been assigned until 30 minutes after Elijah had already been booked. That was illegal, that was proof, and it was just the beginning. Ava then turned her attention to Elijah's case file. What she found made her stomach tighten. There was no public defender listed. The documents indicated he had waived his right to counsel, but the signature on the waiver didn't match his handwriting. There were also notes in the margins, handwritten, rushed, mentioning uncooperative attitude, possible gang affiliation, and known neighborhood troublemaker. None of that was substantiated. None of it had relevance to a broken storefront window, and none of it belonged in a legal file unless someone was trying to shape a narrative before trial. She also discovered that Elijah had been held for over 18 hours before being allowed a phone call. By then, the public story was already being shaped. Juvenile delinquent, prior warnings, possible repeat offender, all fabricated, none verified. Ava dug deeper, going beyond this single case. She submitted subpoenas for other arrests Logan had made over the past 5 years involving minors. It didn't take long for a pattern to emerge. Vague charges, rushed paperwork, procedural holes, and a consistent absence of legal representation during key moments of process. Names started to appear again and again. Judges who approved warrants in minutes. Prosecutors who never challenged evidence. Supervisors who signed off without review. The system was working exactly how Logan needed it to. That wasn't a coincidence. It was architecture, and it had been built over time. Ava wasn't just looking for mistakes. She was uncovering intent. With each file, she saw the shape of a broader operation. Isolate, discredit, bury. Every youth who came through Logan's orbit was either turned into a statistic or pressured into silence. Ava kept her team working through the night, cataloging each detail, linking each inconsistency with legal codes and departmental policy violations. She knew how fast things could vanish when you got too close to the truth, so she documented everything. Off-site backups, encrypted storage, secure servers. She wasn't going to let them pull the plug on this. The more she unearthed, the more resistance she felt. Suddenly, her formal requests for internal department communications were delayed due to administrative backlog. Clerks stopped returning her calls. A memo went out reminding court personnel to follow standard lines of authority when processing legal reviews. She wasn't surprised. She expected it, but it confirmed she was getting closer. Then came the missing footage. She requested the precinct's hallway security feed for the night Elijah was brought in. The timestamp showed Logan escorting the boy through the back entrance, not the main intake area, and walking him into an interview room that wasn't equipped with recording equipment. There was no arrest footage from that point forward. The next documented moment was Elijah's mugshot, his lips split, his eyes swollen, and no one had filed an incident report. Ava stared at the still frame for nearly 5 minutes. That image, more than any memo or manipulated report, was the truth. A boy had been hurt, and the system hadn't just failed him, it had erased the evidence. But she wasn't just going to expose it, she was going to dismantle it. She knew what to do next. She needed the one thing the files didn't show, the piece that couldn't be doctored, the piece that connected all of it together. Someone had to know what happened that night. Someone who had been there, seen it, lived it, and never spoke. She had nearly every document, every log, every forged signature. But to crack this wide open, to bring down Logan and everything built around him, she needed the final piece. She needed the missing witness. Because to unmask Logan fully, she had to find the one thing he couldn't control, the missing piece of truth. But to take Logan down, Ava needed to find the last puzzle piece. She needed the one witness Logan hadn't been able to erase. Because to unmask Logan, she had to find the piece he didn't leave in the file, the one he couldn't forge, hide, or silence. She had to find the missing piece. But to expose Logan for good, she had to find the one missing piece he hadn't been able to control yet. But to unmask Logan, she had to find the missing piece, the one thread that pulled it all together, the one person Logan didn't expect to talk. But to reveal the full picture, Ava had to find the missing piece, the one witness Logan couldn't bury. The files didn't land on Ava Daniels's desk through the usual chain of custody. They came in an unmarked envelope, slid beneath her hotel room door in the early hours of the morning, sealed with nothing more than a single paperclip. Inside were copies, pristine, unedited, raw, internal memos, disciplinary reports that never made it to the record, body cam logs flagged as inaccessible, and a printout of an email thread between Logan Reed and his immediate supervisor detailing alternative booking procedures for youth suspects, the kind of communication that doesn't just violate policy, it exposes collusion, the kind that doesn't exist unless someone had access deep inside the system. At the bottom of the envelope was a post-it note with 5 words, hastily scribbled, "We need to talk, Eric." No last name, no contact number. But Ava didn't need either. She'd already noticed the court clerk during her first walk through the Charleston courthouse. Young, sharp, always watching. His name tag read Eric Sanders, and he was the kind of person who looked like he didn't want to be noticed, which made him unforgettable to someone like Ava. She'd caught the flicker in his eyes when Logan walked by, the tension, the hesitation, the kind of suppressed reaction that came from knowing more than you were allowed to say. She hadn't approached him then, timing was everything. But now, with this envelope in hand, she knew exactly who he was, and she knew the risk he had just taken. They met in secret, late that same night, in the back room of a shuttered bookstore owned by Eric's cousin. No cameras, no traffic, just whispered confessions and the hum of a portable fan. Eric was visibly nervous, his leg bouncing beneath the table, fingers tugging at the sleeves of his sweatshirt. But his eyes stayed locked on Ava's, as if her calm gave him a sliver of courage to speak what had been bottled up for years. He'd been working in the clerk's office for 4 years, long enough to see patterns, long enough to know which files disappeared before they were scanned, which arrest reports always arrived late, which officers had a history of skipping protocol with no consequences. Logan's name appeared often but always buried under layers of formality. According to Eric, it wasn't just sloppiness, it was deliberate. There were back doors in the system, and Logan had keys to all of them. "He doesn't even try to hide it anymore," Eric whispered, "because he knows no one's watching." Until now, Eric had started copying documents in secret 6 months earlier, not to go public. He wasn't brave enough for that, but to keep a record, just in case something ever pushed him to act. Ava had been that push. The moment he saw her in the courtroom, sitting still, holding power without using force, he knew she was the one person who might actually do something with the truth. So he took the risk. Ava asked for more. Every file Eric had ever pulled, every irregularity he'd logged, every name he'd flagged. He hesitated, not because he doubted her, but because he knew what would happen if anyone found out. "They don't just fire people," he said. "They erase them." But he handed it over anyway. A flash drive, black and unmarked, taped to the underside of a file folder. It contained more than Ava expected. 27 flagged cases, internal communication strings, and most importantly, a list of login credentials used to falsify timestamps, one of which belonged to a senior administrator in the judge's chambers. Ava felt the shift in her gut. This wasn't just about Logan anymore. The corruption reached higher, deeper. She thanked Eric, told him to be careful, to lie low. He tried to smile. She didn't see him again after that. Not in court, not at his office. 2 days later, Ava received word he'd been transferred on emergency reassignment to another county hours away. No explanation, no announcement. When she tried to reach him, his phone was disconnected. A colleague in the clerk's office let slip that Eric had cleared his desk in 15 minutes, escorted by 2 uniformed officers, not police, private security. The message was clear. Someone knew, and someone wanted him gone before he could talk again. That night, Ava received an anonymous voicemail on her burner phone. A man's voice, calm, measured. "Back off," it said. "We know where you're staying. Don't make this worse for yourself or anyone helping you." No threat screamed, no violence promised, just certainty. It was the kind of message sent by people who didn't need to shout. She played it twice, memorized the tone, then deleted it. She knew what had happened to Eric. They didn't need to kill him. They just needed to remove him from the equation, intimidate the next person from stepping forward, make an example of silence. But Ava wasn't the next person. She was the wrong person to threaten. Still, it told her everything she needed to know. What she was pulling on wasn't just a loose thread. It was a steel cable, buried beneath decades of protection. And the people yanking it back weren't just foot soldiers like Logan. They were architects, which meant taking Logan down wouldn't be enough. There was someone else, someone pulling strings behind him, shielding him, erasing people like Eric before they could speak. Ava understood now. The system wasn't just corrupt, it was guarded, and Logan Reed was never the top of the chain. Ava understood this system wouldn't fall easily, because behind Logan stood someone more dangerous. It didn't take long for Ava Daniels to identify the puppet master. The more files she traced, the more inconsistencies she followed, the more clear it became that none of this, the cover-ups, the erased reports, the sudden disappearances, could happen without someone at the top pulling the strings. And in Charleston, the top meant one name: Richard Nolan, Chief of Police. The title sounded ceremonial, a bureaucratic role with oversight and press responsibilities, but Nolan wasn't some PR fake. He had been in power for 16 years, a figure of near-mythic control in the city's justice circles, a man who knew how to keep his fingerprints off everything while directing everyone. He'd built the system to protect officers like Logan, officers who got things done, regardless of the means. Ava found his name woven quietly into nearly every obstruction she hit. When a request for records was denied without cause, it came from a department overseen by Nolan. When Eric Sanders disappeared, the uniformed men who escorted him out belonged to a private security firm with contracts tied to Nolan's former consulting company. When Ava submitted a follow-up complaint to Internal Affairs, she received a response. Unsigned, no return address, quoting policy revisions initiated by Nolan's office. He wasn't hiding. He didn't need to. Nolan operated with the confidence of someone who believed he would never be touched. He was Charleston's untouchable. So when Ava received word that he wanted to meet her face-to-face, she accepted without hesitation. The meeting didn't happen in a courtroom or a city office. It happened in a quiet, upscale restaurant on the edge of downtown, where the linen was starched and the servers didn't ask questions. She arrived first, sat alone, glass of water untouched. Nolan entered 5 minutes late, calm and composed, dressed in plain clothes, no badge, no entourage. He moved like a man completely in control of the space around him. He slid into the booth across from her and didn't bother with introductions. "You've stirred up a lot of dust," he said, voice low, almost pleasant. "People are starting to ask questions that haven't been asked in years." Ava didn't respond. She didn't need to. Nolan leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, tone still casual. "I understand your passion," he said, I even admire your tenacity, but you're crossing into dangerous territory, and I need you to understand what's at stake." He paused, watching her face, no reaction, so he dropped the pretense. "If you don't stop, we will bury you," he said, flat and clear. "Your credibility, your influence, your entire career. You'll be disbarred, disgraced, and politically neutralized before the year is out, and no one will remember why you started this in the first place." Ava didn't blink. Nolan smiled faintly, like he'd just recited a weather report. "This city," he continued, "runs on stability, on order. The people here don't want justice. They want predictability. Officers like Logan deliver that. They keep things quiet, clean, manageable. And sometimes that means making hard decisions, ones people like you don't understand." His eyes were sharp now, the smile gone. "You're not from here. You don't know what it takes to keep a city like this from burning." Ava leaned back, her eyes never leaving his. She still said nothing. Nolan took a sip of water, then placed both hands on the table, palms flat. "You can walk away from this," he said. "No harm, no noise, no more digging. You'll go back to Washington with your dignity intact, maybe even get some good press for trying. But if you keep going, well, we'll make sure no one ever lets you step into a courtroom again." The silence stretched, long enough for the server to approach, ask if they were ready to order, and receive 2 simultaneous, silent stares that sent him away without a word. Nolan broke the silence first. "This isn't personal," he said. "It's structural. You can't fight the system when the system doesn't want to be fought." Ava finally spoke. Just one sentence. "I've fought worse." Nolan chuckled, but there was no humor in it. He stood up, straightened his jacket, and nodded once. "We'll see," he said. Then he walked out, leaving the table empty, the threat lingering like the aftertaste of a bitter drink. Ava sat still for a few moments longer, then reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She'd recorded everything, not for leverage, not for headlines, for history, for documentation, so no one could say, "It didn't happen." She left the restaurant without looking back, walking through Charleston's quiet streets with a focus sharpened by pressure. Nolan's threat wasn't unique. Men like him always believed fear was a final weapon. They underestimated the power of surviving worse. Ava had been here before, on the other side of silence, staring down those who thought their shadows made them invisible. She didn't break then. She wasn't going to break now. Nolan thought she was just a politician. He forgot she was forged in courtrooms, in protests, in nights spent defending the defenseless. She had been threatened, smeared, silenced, and stood back up each time with more to lose. This wasn't the first powerful man who tried to bury her. It wouldn't be the last. But what they always failed to understand was simple. Ava didn't fight for safety. She fought for truth. And the more dangerous the truth became, the more committed she was to bringing it into the light. Nolan had revealed himself, and that made him vulnerable, because now she knew where the rot started. And once you know that, you don't stop digging. You go straight for the root. Nolan didn't scare her, because Ava had already been buried once, and she came back stronger. But Ava wasn't afraid. She had already been crushed before and survived. The storm came quickly, not with shouts or flashing lights, but with cold precision and careful orchestration. One day after her meeting with Richard Nolan, Ava Daniels's name started circulating in news feeds, but not in the way it had for most of her career. Headlines didn't mention corruption or cover-ups. They didn't talk about Logan Reed or the files she had uncovered. Instead, they questioned her character, her judgment, her sanity. "Congresswoman Daniels accused of defamation," one banner read. Another, "Daniels fabricates evidence, says source inside courthouse." An editorial on a local Charleston news site used words like unstable, reckless, unfit for office. She hadn't even spoken publicly yet. The media blitz moved faster than she could track. Anonymous sources were suddenly everywhere. Staffers who claimed she'd bullied them, lawyers who said she pressured witnesses, emails taken out of context and leaked to stir doubt. An entire narrative was being built around her, carefully assembled to erode her credibility 1 inch at a time. Cable pundits picked it up. Why is she inserting herself into a city that's not her district? Why go after a decorated police officer without hard evidence? Why now? And just like that, Ava became the story. Not the system, not the corruption, not the abuse. Her. The whistleblower, the threat. The press requests stopped coming. Even outlets she had trusted during her civil rights work ghosted her. Her statements were edited down to sound angry, irrational. She gave a measured press conference in D.C. laying out what she had found, naming names, presenting facts. No one aired it live. The clips that circulated cut out every mention of Richard Nolan. The headlines afterward focused only on one sentence, "I will not back down." That soundbite became the hook for a new smear. Ava Daniels, unhinged radical, attacking the system for attention. Inside Congress, things turned colder. A few colleagues sent quiet texts of support, but none stood beside her publicly. Some began floating calls for an ethics investigation. One committee chair hinted she should take a leave of absence to cool things down. Her chief of staff was pulled into a meeting with party leadership and returned pale, unable to repeat the threats made behind closed doors. Then the calls started. Donors withdrawing, events canceled, endorsements revoked. Ava's name was becoming toxic. She wasn't surprised. She'd known this would come. But the speed hurt. The silence from people she once trusted hurt more. Colleagues who'd once praised her for her integrity now avoided eye contact in the Capitol hallways. Former allies ghosted her. Staffers quit. Even friends outside politics sent polite messages saying they needed to step back for a while. She watched her network shrink into a void. And still she pressed forward. Because the worst part wasn't even the media, the isolation, or the political fallout. It was what happened to her witness. 2 weeks after Eric Sanders passed her the flash drive, she got a call from a local contact. One of the witnesses tied to Elijah's case, a retired janitor who had seen Logan bring the boy in the back entrance of the precinct that night, was in the hospital. Car accident. That was the official story. The car was totaled. The man survived, but with a shattered hip and multiple fractures. The police report blamed him for running a red light. There were no street cameras in the area, no dash cam footage, just the word of 2 officers on the scene, both under Nolan's command. Ava visited the hospital. The man wouldn't speak. His eyes were terrified. His wife asked her not to come again. "Please," she said, voice trembling. "We've already lost too much." Ava understood. She left quietly. She didn't go to the press. She didn't demand a hearing. She added the incident to her file. The system wasn't just retaliating, it was tightening. It was reminding everyone watching that helping her came with a price, a steep one. That night, Ava sat in her office long after the lights had dimmed, alone. The walls around her felt colder than usual. Her desk was empty except for the growing pile of evidence she'd gathered. Documents, videos, voice recordings, proof no one wanted to see. She had risked everything, and it was costing her piece by piece. But she didn't feel regret, not yet. She looked at the photo on her wall, her brother Marcus, smiling at 17, a future never lived, and she reminded herself why she started. Not for headlines, not for applause, but for justice. The kind that doesn't get handed out unless someone fights for it. Ava had known the risks when she stepped into this city's shadows, but even knowing hadn't fully prepared her for the depth of its resistance. This wasn't about truth anymore. It was about survival. They weren't just trying to discredit her, they were trying to erase her. But Ava had something they didn't understand. She'd already lost before. She'd already been broken and rebuilt. They couldn't shame her into silence, because she wasn't here for comfort. She was here to finish what she started. She was here for everyone who'd ever been buried without justice. They thought darkness would swallow her whole. What they didn't know was that in the dark, sometimes, people find the clearest light. But in the darkness, sometimes, people find the clearest light. Ava Daniels had always suspected Logan Reed wasn't acting alone. But what she uncovered next was more than complicity. It was infrastructure. It started with one file buried in the metadata of the documents Eric Sanders had passed her, a digital signature from another officer, Sergeant Tyler Brooks. His name hadn't come up in Elijah's arrest, but he'd approved the report's final version. Ava ran his history and found something odd. Brooks had signed off on multiple juvenile arrest reports that bore identical language, identical timestamps, and suspiciously consistent technical issues with their body cam footage. That was enough to raise a flag, so she widened the search. She requested access to archived reports from the last 7 years across 3 precincts. What emerged wasn't chaos, it was pattern. Officers who moved together from one district to another, always in rotations that matched up with internal restructuring. Dozens of cases that ended without charges, youths detained for hours, even days, with no formal booking. Logs rewritten, cameras disconnected, medical records showing minor injuries never mentioned in police narratives. At the center of nearly every thread was a small, tight group. Brooks, Officer Dana Whitaker, Corporal James Ellison, and Logan Reed. All of them had arrest records that looked textbook perfect. Clean language, flawless timing, signed approved. But Ava had been a civil rights attorney long enough to know that real police work, especially in neighborhoods constantly under surveillance, never looked that neat. These weren't accidents. These were cover operations, carefully coordinated, quietly executed. And every time something went wrong, if a complaint was filed, if a parent asked too many questions, the response was fast and uniform. Deny, bury, discredit. Ava built a map, literally. She pinned arrest locations, mapped officer shifts, tracked badge sign-ins to department systems. She saw patrol cars parked in alleys for hours, officers rerouting themselves off dispatch logs, juvenile suspects always fitting the same vague profile. Resisting, agitated, prior record. It was a machine, and Logan was just one cog. It wasn't until she traced a string of incidents near a shuttered recreation center that the scale truly hit her. There, in a span of 6 months, 6 boys were picked up, 3 with physical injuries that required hospital visits, 2 were later expelled from school due to unrelated disciplinary histories that mysteriously surfaced after their arrests. 1 moved out of state, none filed formal complaints. Ava tracked down the families. Most refused to speak. 1 mother finally did, briefly, over the phone. Voice shaking. "They told me if I made trouble I'd lose my job," she said. "That they'd find something on me. I couldn't take that risk. I have 2 other kids." When Ava asked who they were, the line went silent, then disconnected. These weren't isolated incidents. They were coordinated. And all signs pointed to an internal task force Nolan had quietly greenlit 3 years prior under the name Youth Risk Intervention. On paper, it was meant to identify at-risk minors and offer early intervention before they slipped through the cracks. In reality, it was a predatory surveillance program, no oversight, no accountability. Ava finally understood. Logan wasn't just a rogue cop. He was part of an enforcement unit trained to hunt shadows and suppress statistics. Their goal wasn't to solve crime, it was to control perception, keep numbers low, keep neighborhoods compliant. She pulled the task force's funding documents. The line items were vague. Equipment, community support, response readiness. 1 line caught her attention. Operational discretion. A legal catch-all used to shield unrecorded actions from audit. Nolan had created this. He didn't just protect it, he built it. Logan was never acting on impulse. He was following policy, a silent one, passed down not in memos but in knowing looks and unspoken rules. And that's why no one questioned him, because they were all part of it. Ava stared at the wall of evidence. A mural of faces, documents, arrows, and patterns. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what it meant. The problem wasn't Logan. The problem was systemic, and systemic meant dangerous. No one had ever touched this network. Too many careers were tied to it. Too many promotions earned by looking the other way. Ava knew what this meant. If she wanted to bring it down, it wouldn't be about one trial. It would mean dismantling an ecosystem built to self-protect. It would mean confronting a legacy of sanctioned abuse woven into the city's foundation. It would mean more threats, more isolation, more witnesses disappear. But also meant something else. Opportunity. Because networks, no matter how secretive, leave traces. And once you start pulling the right threads, the whole thing can unravel. Ava circled the names again, this time highlighting not the officers, but the supervisors who approved them. The deputy chiefs, the assistant DAs, the internal investigators who closed complaints without follow-up. This wasn't just a ring of rogue cops. It was a protection racket cloaked in law and order. Ava stood in the center of her office, eyes scanning every inch of the wall, every connection she'd made. She wasn't hunting Logan anymore. She was chasing a syndicate. And to stop it, she couldn't just expose it. She had to disrupt it, tear it out at the root. Because the real threat wasn't the badge, it was the silence behind it. It was the system that chose quiet over justice, that punished anyone who broke ranks. And she was done being quiet. But to sever the chain of crimes, Ava had to do the one thing no one before her had dared to try. To break the system, she had to take it on in full. Because if she wanted to cut the chain of corruption, she'd have to do what no one had ever dared to attempt. To sever the chain of crimes, Ava had to do what no one before her had ever dared. Ava Daniels filed the lawsuit at 9:03 a.m. on a Monday that would change the course of Charleston's legal history. It wasn't just a complaint. It was a full-blown, scorched-earth countersuit against Logan Reed, Chief Richard Nolan, and the Charleston Police Department as a whole. She named every department head, every officer connected to the task force, and every administrative official who had signed off on manipulated records, suppressed footage, or silent cover-ups. The documents ran over 300 pages, backed by digital evidence, sworn affidavits, timelines, transcripts, and forensic reports. Her legal filing demanded the immediate reopening of 23 closed cases involving minors, each previously buried under lack of probable cause or insufficient evidence. But Ava's files told a different story, one of coordinated suppression, falsified testimony, and a deliberate systemic campaign to profile, intimidate, and erase the most vulnerable. Her lawsuit didn't just ask for damages. It demanded accountability, criminal charges, federal oversight, and public hearings. She filed it in federal court, bypassing local jurisdiction entirely. No more local judges, no more Charleston politics. This case would rise above the city that had tried to bury her. Within hours, word spread. News outlets that had once painted her as erratic now scrambled to report the filing. Headlines changed tone. Congresswoman Daniels sues Charleston PD in explosive civil rights case. Lawsuit alleges citywide cover-up in police abuse of minors. She had forced the narrative back into truth's hands, and the system felt it. Internally, fractures began to form. Ava noticed the shift immediately. Young staffers from city agencies began reaching out quietly. Emails with no signatures, burner numbers with blocked IDs, messages saying things like, "I have something you need to see," or "I've been sitting on this for too long." They were analysts, assistants, IT clerks, people who weren't powerful but who were present, who had watched documents being edited, reports vanish, logs rewritten, who had remained silent not out of loyalty but out of fear. Ava offered them protection, legal immunity where possible, anonymity where necessary. She brought on a second legal team made up of young civil rights attorneys who worked pro bono and believed, like she did, that justice only lived when people risked everything to make it breathe. She started calling these new allies the Quiet Army. They came one by one, but soon she had nearly a dozen young insiders feeding her what the system never thought would see daylight: meeting notes, department memos, voice recordings of mid-level managers giving verbal orders to clean up reports, or flag the right kids for risk documentation. What shocked Ava most wasn't how much they knew. It was how long they'd been waiting for someone to fight back. "We thought we were crazy," one woman told her. "Every time I saw something wrong, I'd report it and nothing would happen. I started to think maybe I was the problem, but now I know I'm not alone." That was the power of her lawsuit. It gave people a reason to believe, but belief was dangerous. The more support Ava gained, the more desperate the other side became. First came the legal responses: motions to dismiss, claims of improper procedure, counterfilings accusing her of political grandstanding. The city's legal counsel argued that Ava had no standing, that the cases were ancient history, that revisiting them would destabilize the community. But Ava wasn't afraid of destabilization. She wanted it, because what was already stable was unacceptable. When the media tried to pivot the story back toward political spectacle, Ava refused interviews. She released documents instead. She let the truth speak louder than her voice ever could. Photos, medical reports, redacted emails from Nolan's office authorizing preliminary holding measures for juveniles who hadn't been charged. The noise got louder. Protests reignited. The names of the forgotten youth Ava fought for appeared on signs, on T-shirts, on courthouse steps. Parents came forward, their voices shaking but resolute. "My son was one of them," one mother cried on live television. "They took him, they lied, and they made me feel like I had no power, but Ava Daniels is giving it back." Still, Ava never let the public attention distract from the legal war she was waging. She spent 16-hour days coordinating her teams, reviewing newly submitted documents, preparing witness lists, and filing federal motions to protect the most vulnerable from retaliation. She knew the system would fight back, but for the first time, it was on the defensive. It was no longer hunting her in silence. It was exposed, dragged into a light it couldn't withstand. Internal factions within the department began to split. Whistleblower protections were triggered. A few officers resigned for personal reasons. One turned state's witness. But Ava knew it wasn't over, because when systems start to crack, those who built them don't step down quietly. They sabotage, they smear, they retaliate, and Ava felt it in the air. The shifting tone, the anxious messages from allies, the veiled warnings. One of her new insiders reported seeing files being shredded after hours. Another said he'd been followed to his car. A third went completely silent. Ava understood the danger. It was always part of the deal. But she also knew she was past the point of return. The case had been filed. The evidence was growing. The people were watching, and for the first time, so was the federal government. Still, she didn't let herself exhale, because predators don't vanish when cornered. They strike. She had named the names. She had laid out the map, and now every one of them was watching her back, waiting for the right moment to kill the momentum. Because evil doesn't go quietly. Not when truth is finally stepping into the light. But the forces she was fighting wouldn't stand by and watch the truth rise. The darkness wouldn't let go without a fight. Because the villains in this story would never sit still while justice walked into the room. But the corrupt would not stand idly by and watch the truth step into the light. The system didn't wait long to strike back. Barely a week after Ava Daniels filed her sweeping federal lawsuit, she was served a subpoena, this time not as a plaintiff but as a defendant. The charge? Abuse of power and unethical conduct while in public office. The claim was that Ava had used her position in Congress to coerce local law enforcement, manipulate judicial procedures, and tamper with sensitive investigation. The wording was slick, carefully crafted, full of legal ambiguity and vague assertions. But Ava knew exactly what it was. A trap, laid out with precision, designed to flip the narrative. They couldn't beat her with evidence, so they'd tried to bury her with accusation. The indictment came from the state attorney general's office, pushed by political allies of Nolan and backed by a sudden flurry of media leaks. Old emails out of context, a staffer's complaint that she'd pressured them to work extra hours, a private conversation twisted into an insinuation of misconduct. Headlines screamed, "Congresswoman under investigation for misuse of office." Did Ava Daniels go too far? Hero or hypocrite? It was character assassination disguised as justice. But the timing wasn't subtle. It came on the heels of her lawsuit gaining traction. It followed the first court hearing that ruled in her favor for subpoenaing sealed police records. It followed 3 former officers agreeing to testify on her behalf, and it followed a growing movement across Charleston, citizens marching, holding signs that read, "We believe Ava," parents shouting into bullhorns about children lost to silence. The people were waking up, and the system panicked. But this indictment wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was psychological warfare. Ava faced the very real possibility of losing her congressional seat, her law license, and her freedom. The prosecution moved fast, requesting an emergency hearing to determine if she should be suspended from office pending trial. Ava's legal team scrambled to respond, but even they knew the system had home field advantage. News coverage split down the middle. One half echoed the state's narrative, painting Ava as a rogue official on a personal vendetta, a woman who let emotion cloud legality. The other half pushed back, reminding viewers of the evidence, the suppressed cases, the voices Ava had amplified. Activists flooded social media with side-by-side photos of Ava and the boys, whose records she had reopened. Stand with Ava trended for days. Protesters took to the steps of the courthouse, forming human chains around the building, chanting her name. Teenagers she had never met called her their hero. Ava watched it all with measured calm. She didn't let herself get swept up in the emotion, because she knew the system wasn't done. This was phase 2. Discredit, isolate, prosecute. They wanted her name off the record, her face off the news, her work erased from the public conversation. They were willing to frame her to protect themselves. And the sad truth? It might work. The grand jury was being assembled quietly. The state used procedural speed to outmaneuver her federal filing, and even as the public rallied, Ava knew that behind closed doors deals were being made. Judges leaned on, committee chairs brief, favors called in. The pressure was suffocating. Her allies were terrified. Her legal team warned her, "If they move forward, you could be facing jail time." She nodded, taking the information in but not showing fear. She didn't have time for fear. She had seen this tactic before, back when she defended activists charged with inciting unrest after police killed unarmed youth. She had defended people whose lives were destroyed not because of what they did, but because of what they exposed. And now it was her turn in the crosshairs. But Ava Daniels wasn't built to fold. She reviewed the indictment line by line, then made a call to her lead counsel. "Let them come," she said. "We're not blinking." Then she did something that caught everyone off guard. She called a press conference. Standing alone, no podium, no flag, no handlers, just a microphone on the courthouse steps, Ava looked directly into the cameras and said, "The system is afraid. That's why I'm standing here. Not for what I've done, but for what I've uncovered. They want to punish me for shining a light. But I'm not stepping back. I'm stepping forward. If they want to put me on trial, they better be ready to put the truth on trial too." The crowd roared. Across the city, people started pouring into the streets. Teachers, pastors, nurses, factory workers. Citizens who'd never marched for anything now filled the sidewalks with signs and stories. A second movement began to grow, louder than the smear campaign, more durable than a news cycle. But Ava knew noise alone wasn't enough. She had to act, because this was more than a smear. It was a final warning from a system desperate to survive, and it meant only one thing. It was time to strike back, not just in defense, but to end this. It was time to go beyond exposure and deliver a blow the system couldn't recover from. They had indicted her, tried to bury her, threatened her future, but they'd forgotten something. Ava Daniels never started fights she didn't intend to finish. That's when she decided to hit them where it hurt the most. That was the moment she chose her next move, and this time, it would be fatal. That's when Ava decided it was time to deliver the killing blow. That was the moment she chose to strike. That was the moment. Ava decided to launch her most devastating move yet. That's when Ava made her decision. It was time for the knockout. That's when Ava decided to deliver the final blow. That was the moment she decided to strike with precision. No hesitation, no retreat. That's when she decided to hit back hard. That's when Ava decided it was time to strike the system's heart. That's the moment she decided to land her deadliest blow. That was when she chose to hit back with everything she had. That's when she decided to deliver the final, devastating strike. That's when Ava decided to strike back, this time with the kill shot. That was the moment she decided to go for the throat. That's when she chose to deliver the system's death sentence. That's when she decided to deliver the final, fatal strike. That was the moment Ava Daniels chose her counterattack. That was the moment she decided to strike with full force. That's when she decided to go for the kill. That's when she chose to land her most devastating blow yet. That's when Ava made her decision to deliver the finishing move. That was the moment she decided to land the critical blow. That's when she decided to strike hard, fast, and final. That's when Ava decided to launch her final, most dangerous move. That's when she chose to end this once and for all. That's the moment she decided to strike back with the killing blow. That's when Ava decided it was time to land the system's death blow. That was the moment Ava made her decision. It was time to strike. Ava Daniels knew there would never be real justice behind closed doors, so she opened them all. With her credibility under fire and her name in the crosshairs, she pushed forward with her boldest move yet. A fully public hearing, streamed live, no redactions, no edits, no backroom negotiations. She rented a civic hall in downtown Charleston, the largest space she could legally convert into a public legal forum, and invited every major media outlet in the country. She didn't rely on traditional press either. She partnered with live streamers, independent journalists, grassroots activists. She made sure the cameras were already rolling before the first seat was filled. And then she sat at the head of the room, not as a politician, not as a lawyer, but as the one voice willing to stand between the truth and its burial. The hearing was framed not as a trial, but a presentation of evidence, a public record that no one could later claim they hadn't seen. Her legal team brought in poster boards with timelines, printed emails, blown-up medical reports, and photos. Each seat in the room had a printed program with QR codes linking to the documents online, accessible in real time to anyone watching from home. The place filled fast. Journalists, concerned citizens, families of victims, former staffers, even members of Congress who had finally grown a spine. The city couldn't stop it. It was federal now, and the cameras made it unkillable. Ava opened the session with one statement, delivered in a calm, unwavering voice. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's been told to sit down, shut up, and survive. Today, they speak. Then came the witnesses. One by one, they stepped up, not just lawyers or professionals, but real people. A mother whose son had been taken from school in handcuffs for suspicious behavior and returned 3 days later bruised and silent. A former officer who had resigned in protest after being ordered to stand down when another officer roughed up a teen. A social worker who testified that records of abuse were routinely ignored when the officer involved wore the wrong nameplate. And the janitor, the one who had been hit by a car, he appeared via video call from a rehabilitation center, his legs still in a brace, his voice trembling but strong. I saw Logan bring that boy in through the side door. I saw him go in, and I never saw a lawyer walk in after that. Gasps echoed in the room. The media started live showing the quotes as they came in. The chat sections on the live stream platforms exploded. People from across the country flooding in, watching, sharing. The pressure built with each testimony. The pattern was undeniable. Every story intersected with another. Names kept repeating. Dates lined up. Internal memos matched victim accounts. No one could deny the architecture anymore. It wasn't just misconduct, it was institutional rot. And Ava let it speak for itself. She didn't interrupt. She didn't editorialize. She simply let them talk, page after page of documented reality, until even the most skeptical viewers began to see the truth unfold in real time. The final section of the hearing was reserved for direct questioning. Ava had reserved one seat for Logan Reed, subpoenaed, compelled by court order, forced to appear under oath. He walked in with his attorney, head high, still wearing the arrogance of someone who'd been protected his entire career. But the room was different now. There were no whispering judges or shielding chiefs. There were cameras. There were victims. There was Ava. She waited for the murmurs to settle, then leaned into her microphone. "Officer Reed," she said, her voice precise, quiet, controlled. "You've denied involvement in any of the acts presented today. You've said, under oath, that you did your job lawfully and without bias." Logan nodded stiffly, his lawyer tense beside him. Ava didn't blink. "Then explain this." She tapped her tablet and brought up a video on the main screen behind her. It was body cam footage, corrupted, missing frames, but Ava had restored it with forensic software. The room watched as the audio kicked in halfway through. Logan's voice could be heard yelling, someone crying in the background, a slamming door, then silence. The timestamp matched the night Elijah Price was arrested. The courtroom didn't react with noise this time. It just went still. Logan looked at the screen. His lawyer whispered something. Ava turned to him again. "You say you acted alone, but the task force logs place you on duty with Sergeant Brooks that night. Why is his name missing from the report?" Logan didn't answer. The silence was louder than any defense. Ava leaned back in her chair. "You say these kids resisted, but the medical records tell a different story. Broken ribs, concussions, and in every case the video files are incomplete." Again, no answer. His lawyer tried to interrupt. Ava raised her hand. "One more question." She waited until the room was silent again. Then she looked Logan dead in the eye. "Why are so many kids afraid of you, Officer Reed?" The question didn't echo in the room. It landed like a brick. The audience didn't gasp. They held their breath. The reporters didn't scribble. They froze. And for the first time since Ava had launched her investigation, Logan looked like a man without armor. No words, no smirk, just the heavy, brutal weight of exposure. And then Ava asked one question, just one, that made the entire nation fall silent. The room was silent long before Ava Daniels delivered the question. But after it, the silence became something else entirely. Not emptiness, not hesitation. It became weight. It became reckoning. Ava sat forward slightly in her chair, eyes fixed on Logan Reed, her voice calm and clear, but loud enough for every mic, every camera, every person breathing inside that room to hear. "If I were a white man," she asked, "would you have slapped me?" No theatrics, no anger, just a question that sliced through every layer of authority, every excuse, every line of rehearsed defense. Logan didn't answer, not right away. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. He blinked. He looked to his attorney, then back at Ava, then down at the table, a twitch in his jaw, a shift in his seat, but still nothing. The audience didn't move. Journalists, spectators, officers, victims. Everyone held their breath, because they all knew the answer. Logan knew it. His lawyer knew it. The people watching from their phones, laptops, television screens knew it. That slap, delivered weeks ago, wasn't just violence. It was a declaration, and now, confronted with its implication, Logan had nowhere to go. If he said no, he'd be lying. If he said yes, he'd be admitting everything. The racism, the bias, the arrogance that had cloaked his actions in impunity for years. And so, like every coward faced with truth, he said nothing. Ava let the silence stretch. She didn't interrupt. She didn't repeat the question. She just stared at him. Not with fury, not with disdain, but with certainty. The kind of certainty that turns the tide of a trial. The kind that strips a man of power without touching him. Her words had exposed what 100 files and a dozen testimonies couldn't. The root, the truth behind it all. That the system didn't fear her because of what she'd found. It feared her because of who she was. A black woman, in a courtroom, asking questions no one else had the nerve to ask. Logan's silence told the country everything it needed to know, not just about him, but about the entire institution that had protected him. Ava turned slightly to the room. Her expression didn't change. "I didn't need a badge," she said quietly. "I didn't need a gavel. I just needed the truth." And he couldn't even face it. The audience remained still, not because they were shocked, but because they were witnessing a moment that couldn't be interrupted. History compacted into one unanswered question. On screen, the live stream ticked past 1 million viewers. Clips were already being shared. The caption beneath every repost was the same. She asked. He couldn't answer. In that moment, Ava wasn't just a congresswoman or a former lawyer or the victim of an assault. She was a mirror, held up to a system that had never expected to be seen so clearly. And Logan, once the face of authority, of discipline, of enforcement, was just a man, cornered by his own cowardice. The judge presiding over the hearing finally broke the tension, clearing his throat gently, trying to shift the session forward. But the weight of the question lingered. It clung to the walls. It rewrote every previous testimony, every fact, every denial. The reporters in the room began to type again, but not the same way as before. This wasn't speculation or opinion. This was confirmation. Ava's legal team didn't need to argue further. They had won the moral verdict. The question was rhetorical, but the consequences were real. It was replayed on every major network, quoted in every editorial, dissected in think pieces and debated on talk shows. Law professors called it one of the most defining courtroom moments of the decade. Social media branded it into cultural memory. But inside the courtroom, Ava didn't celebrate. She didn't smirk or lean back in satisfaction. She simply closed the file in front of her, uncapped her pen, and prepared for the next line of questioning. Because her work wasn't done. She had cracked the surface, but beneath it was still a mountain of lies. Still a system wrapped in its own myths of justice and order. She knew the days ahead would be harder. More attacks, more smear campaigns, more legal tactics to stall or discredit her efforts. But something had changed. She had shifted the burden. The shame no longer rested on the victims. It rested where it belonged. On the men who had built careers off silence, on the institutions that had trained officers like Logan to act without consequence, on the entire architecture that collapsed under a single, quiet question. And so, the hearing continued. Testimonies resumed. Evidence flowed, but nothing in that room would ever be the same, because once the truth is spoken aloud, it cannot be unheard. And once a man like Logan Reed is stripped of the illusion of power, he doesn't get it back. Ava Daniels had delivered a question for the ages, and the silence that followed had become its own verdict. From that moment forward, the balance of power was no longer in the hands of the oppressors. It belonged to those who dared to ask why. From that moment, the battle changed. From that moment on, the system could no longer pretend. From that moment on, the tide turned. From that moment on, the tables began to turn. From that moment, everything changed. From that question forward, the momentum shifted. From that moment on, Ava held the upper hand. From that second of silence, the entire balance of power began to shift. From that moment on, the battle was hers to win. From that moment, the tide had turned. From that question forward, everything tilted in Ava's favor. From there, the game changed completely. From that one unanswered question, the world saw the truth. And from that moment, the balance of power shifted entirely. From that moment on, everything changed. From that single moment, the entire playing field shifted. From that instant forward, the whole fight turned. From that moment, the game was no longer theirs. From that moment, the balance shifted. From that moment on, the battle wasn't even. It was Ava's. From that moment, the tide was no longer turning. It had turned. From that moment forward, everything changed. From that single unanswered question, the balance was broken and rewritten. From that moment forward, the entire equation changed. From that moment, everything turned. From that moment, the fight belonged to her. From that question, the balance of power shifted forever. From that moment, the entire landscape of justice began to tilt. From that moment on, the game changed completely. From that single devastating question, the tables turned. From that moment, the battlefield changed. From that question, the truth emerged, and the old order began to fall. From that moment forward, the entire tide shifted. From that moment, the system's foundation cracked. From that moment, the fight changed hands. From that moment forward, the game was Ava's to finish. From that point on, the momentum belonged to her. From that moment on, the fight turned in her favor. From that question, from that silence, everything began to change. From that one line forward, the entire battle shifted. And from that moment, the game was no longer even, it was hers. From that moment, the momentum was hers. From that moment, the entire balance shifted. From that question, the ground beneath the system began to shake. From that moment forward, the tide turned. The fallout came quickly. Just 48 hours after the public hearing, Logan Reed was officially suspended from the Charleston Police Department, pending an internal and criminal investigation. The announcement came from the mayor's office, not the department itself, and the statement was brief but seismic. Logan had been removed from duty without pay, stripped of access to department databases, and ordered to surrender his badge. For someone who had once strutted through the courthouse like he owned it, the fall was brutal. But it didn't stop there. The very next day, headlines broke nationwide, Police Chief Nolan under federal investigation. The Department of Justice, under mounting public pressure and with overwhelming evidence from Ava's compiled files, opened a full-scale inquiry into Nolan's conduct, financial dealings, and use of departmental resources. What began as a disciplinary action against one officer quickly escalated into a chain reaction that shook the core of Charleston's law enforcement structure. By the end of the week, at least 6 officers across multiple precincts had been named in preliminary indictments, and 3 more were placed on administrative leave. These were not low-level cops, they were supervisors, internal affairs investigators, and task force leaders. Their names had surfaced repeatedly in Ava's evidence, tied to redacted reports, falsified records, and illegal detainments. The house of cards was beginning to fall, one corrupt player at a time. The public response was explosive. Citizens gathered outside the Charleston courthouse demanding further resignations, chanting names not just of Ava and Elijah, but of others who had come forward with stories of abuse and silence. Reporters swarmed the city, turning it into the epicenter of a national reckoning. City officials scrambled to issue statements of support for lawful reform while quietly purging files and preparing legal defenses. But Ava Daniels didn't celebrate. She didn't take a victory lap. She watched the collapse unfold with the quiet, wary focus of someone who knew this wasn't the end. It was just exposure. The deep rot had only begun to surface. What disturbed her most wasn't the corruption. It was how many had enabled it by staying silent. The officers who were arrested began naming names. Under pressure, some turned state's witness in exchange for reduced charges. One senior sergeant admitted that every year, at least a dozen juvenile arrests were flagged for soft review, meaning they were rerouted through a channel Nolan had created to keep them off public record. Another testified that training materials had been unofficially adjusted to allow for discretionary uses of force that would be deemed excessive under federal guidelines. Ava read the transcripts in stunned silence. She had known there was a network. She had not known it ran this deep, that every layer of oversight had been compromised, that entire families were ruined not by isolated abuse but by an engineered system of avoidance. Meanwhile, the backlash came swiftly. Conservative commentators accused her of undermining police integrity. Anonymous threats arrived at her office, warning her to drop it or disappear. Her staff increased security. Her email was hacked. Online trolls began circulating conspiracy theories, painting her as a radical. But none of it mattered. Ava had facts, and the facts were now undeniable. For every officer arrested, there were victims who were finally being heard. Lawsuits were being reopened, old cases being reinvestigated, independent review boards were being formed. The system, once untouchable, was being forced to account for itself. And Ava had become the face of that reckoning. At a press conference, she stood flanked by civil rights lawyers and community leaders. Her message was simple. This is not about one officer or one department. This is about a structure that allowed this abuse to go unchecked for years. We cannot dismantle what we refuse to admit exists, and we cannot heal until we face the truth. The press applauded. So did the people. For the first time in weeks, Ava's name was no longer synonymous with controversy. It was becoming synonymous with courage. Supporters rallied around her. Donations poured in. Organizations across the country reached out, asking how they could help replicate her model of public exposure and pressure. The movement that began with a slap had grown into something that no longer needed Ava to fuel it. It had caught fire on its own, yet Ava remained grounded, because in the midst of arrests and resignations, she understood something that others didn't. There were still powerful players untouched, still silent rooms where decisions were being made to protect the old guard, still dark corners of the system trying to wait out the storm. Logan's downfall was a blow, but it was not the end. Nolan's investigation was progress, but it wasn't closure. The guilty weren't just those who had acted, they were those who had looked away. And those people still had influence, still had resources, still had secrets worth killing for. Ava didn't let the momentum lull her. Because she knew how power worked, it adapted, it deflected, it survived, and the more it was cornered, the more dangerous it became. So while the headlines declared a victory, Ava kept building her case, kept following the trail, kept listening to the people who were still afraid to speak, because if she stopped now, the machine would rebuild itself. No, the fight wasn't over. Ava Daniels understood, with absolute clarity, that the war had only just begun, because Ava knew the battle was far from over. The shockwaves didn't stop at Charleston. Within weeks of Ava Daniels' public hearings and the federal indictments that followed, other cities across the country began to feel the ripple effect. Civil rights groups in Baltimore, St. Louis, Cleveland, and Atlanta started filing requests to reopen closed cases, cases eerily similar in pattern. Excessive force, missing reports, incomplete footage, and suspicious plea deals involving young black defendants. In Los Angeles, a public defender's office launched a full audit of arrests tied to a particular gang unit. In New Orleans, a whistleblower leaked hundreds of internal memos indicating falsified testimony in dozens of convictions. And in Chicago, a group of mothers who had been silently meeting for years finally stepped forward, holding pictures of their sons and demanding that their cases be reviewed under new light. The media coined it the Daniels effect, a wave of public pressure ignited not just by a lawsuit, but by a woman who had refused to be silenced. It wasn't a headline anymore, it was a movement. State legislators, many of whom had watched Ava's hearings with cautious distance, now found themselves cornered by constituents asking hard questions. Town halls filled with frustrated families, petitions exploded with signatures. Governors started appointing task forces and commissions to reassess and rebuild public trust. But Ava wasn't interested in optics. She was watching the roots. In Washington, members of Congress, some of whom had once distanced themselves from Ava, began referencing her work in policy proposals. A new bipartisan coalition emerged, calling for the introduction of a Justice Integrity Act, which would mandate independent oversight boards in all states, create federal protections for whistleblowers within law enforcement, and require the public release of disciplinary records for officers involved in use-of-force incidents. For the first time in years, the momentum for national reform wasn't just reactive, it was coordinated, organized, strategic. Ava had testified before, but now she was invited back, not as a target but as an architect. She stood before the House Judiciary Committee and outlined a 12-point reform plan rooted in data, accountability, and transparency. Her words were precise, not dramatic. Her focus was systemic, not partisan. She reminded the room that what happened in Charleston was not unique, it was simply exposed. Behind closed doors, staffers who once doubted her now quoted her. Opponents who once called her emotional now called her effective. The smear campaigns fizzled. The whisper networks went quiet. Ava's name was being restored, not by PR firms or political handlers, but by the truth. The same journalists who had once questioned her credibility now followed her casework like breaking news. Her inbox, once flooded with threats, now overflowed with requests for guidance, stories from victims, and notes of gratitude from strangers. In Charleston, murals went up, portraits of Ava, bold and defiant, surrounded by the names of the children whose files she had helped unearth. School teachers taught lessons on the trial. Law schools created case studies. Even Ava's harshest critics were forced to concede. She had sparked the most significant justice reform debate in a generation. But while the country was beginning to turn, Ava remained grounded. Her name was cleared, her career redeemed, and her public standing stronger than ever. But she refused to let any of it distract her from the larger mission. Restoring her image was never the point. Dismantling the system that had allowed this suffering to go unseen, that was. She knew full well that many cities would stop at symbolism, that committees would meet and reports would be filed, but real change would require something more. She could feel it in every well-meaning speech, in every careful press release that still danced around the root of the issue: power. Without consequences, power always resets itself. Without accountability, reform is a revolving door. So Ava kept her eyes on the center. She knew the machine wouldn't go down with headlines. It would take something sharper, something final. Nolan's trial was still pending. Logan's silence had made waves, but others were trying to plug the gaps. Officers implicated in her investigation had begun filing appeals. Lawyers were lining up to argue technicalities. And while many departments were cleaning house publicly, Ava had already received word that some had simply reassigned bad actors, not removed them. Cosmetic change. Political smoke. It wasn't enough. She had seen this cycle before. Cities embrace reform just long enough for the public to move on, then bury it under bureaucracy. But Ava Daniels wasn't here to patch cracks. She was here to collapse the walls. She wasn't interested in healing a system that was never built for justice in the first place. She was here to expose it, to deliver a truth so sharp it couldn't be ignored. The country was listening now. The world was watching. She had the microphone, the momentum, and the facts. All she needed was the final move, the undeniable strike that would force the country not just to react, but to act. She had been strategic, patient, relentless. But now she was ready. Because to ignite real change, Ava Daniels knew she needed one last blow, the one that would make denial impossible. But to create true, lasting change, Ava knew she needed one final strike. In the aftermath of a national reckoning, when arrests had been made, resignations handed in, and long-buried truths finally forced into the light, Ava Daniels understood that real change would not come from a courtroom alone. It needed to be written into law. And so she began drafting legislation, not in the shadows, but in full public view. The Ava Daniels Act, a bold and sweeping reform bill, was introduced with a clear goal: to build a justice system rooted in accountability, transparency, and irreversible oversight. The law had two uncompromising pillars. First, it mandated that all interrogations in every police precinct and agency receiving federal funding be recorded from start to finish. No exceptions, no dead cameras, no erased tapes. Every minute of questioning had to be captured by a continuous, time-stamped video feed accessible to both prosecution and defense. Second, it required that internal disciplinary records of law enforcement officers be made publicly accessible through a national registry. No more sealed files, no more quietly transferred officers with violent pasts. The public had a right to know the history of those given the legal authority to detain, interrogate, and use force. Ava worked tirelessly with a team of policy advisors, attorneys, victims' advocates, and technical experts to structure the bill not only with idealism but with airtight legislative precision. Her opponents, unsurprisingly, mobilized quickly. Police unions in several states lobbied aggressively to weaken the bill's language, claiming the act would interfere with operational fluidity and officer safety. They flooded committee hearings with scripted testimony, warned of crippling bureaucracy, and tried to paint Ava as an extremist, out of touch with the realities of policing. But Ava had prepared for this. She brought survivors, parents who had buried their children without knowing why, young men who had been coerced into confessions under threats, attorneys who had watched clients fall into legal traps because of missing footage, and she brought data, miles of it, charts showing the correlation between unrecorded interrogations and wrongful convictions, numbers revealing how often internal complaints were buried, reports detailing how repeat offenders in uniform were recycled instead of removed. The public hearings were streamed live, drawing millions of viewers. Ava spoke plainly, refusing to perform or posture. She told the truth. This bill isn't about punishing police, she said. It's about protecting the people and protecting the profession. If you wear the badge with honor, you have nothing to fear from transparency. She let the facts speak louder than outrage, and the tide began to turn. Civil rights groups joined the push. Editorials changed tone. Moderate lawmakers who had once kept their distance began attaching their names to the proposal. A few brave officers, those who believed in real reform, publicly backed the act, calling it necessary and overdue. What Ava was doing wasn't just symbolic, it was structural, and that terrified those clinging to the old way. When the Ava Daniels Act was brought before the House, it passed with a narrow but undeniable majority. In the Senate, it faced stiffer resistance, but the national pressure, along with Ava's relentless advocacy, forced negotiations. Minor amendments were added, but the core of the bill remained intact. After weeks of procedural delays, the bill passed. The president signed it into law in a nationally televised ceremony with Ava at his side. For the first time in modern history, a federal law named after a black woman directly targeting law enforcement transparency had been written into the American legal framework. Across the country, police departments were ordered to update facilities, install monitoring systems, digitize internal disciplinary logs, and comply with federal audit schedules. An independent federal oversight board was created to enforce the act. Funding was withheld from departments that refused. Resistance still existed, but the law was clear and enforceable, and the change was immediate. Within 6 months, thousands of interrogation rooms had been upgraded, hundreds of internal misconduct records were made public, several criminal appeals were reopened based on newly uncovered officer histories. Community trust, while far from healed, had a place to begin rebuilding. Ava's name, once dragged through headlines as a target, now appeared beside words like trailblazer, architect of reform, guardian of truth. But she didn't let the praise distract her. She didn't write the law to be remembered. She wrote it to prevent the suffering she had witnessed again and again. She wrote it to shift the ground. She wrote it because no one else would. Law schools began teaching the Ava Daniels Act as a landmark in modern justice legislation. Her work became the blueprint for similar efforts in education, housing, and immigration oversight. She spoke at universities not about herself but about systems, strategy, and why speaking truth to power meant more than slogans. It meant law. Journalists who once questioned her began citing her. Her critics were quieter now, many retreating behind carefully worded pivots or vanishing from the debate altogether. But none of that mattered to Ava. What mattered was that, for the first time, the rules of the game had changed, and she had helped rewrite them. And still, Ava knew this wasn't the final page. Laws could be passed, but they could also be ignored. Systems could adapt. Power could shift its disguise. The act was a turning point, but not a conclusion. She had won a battle, but justice, the kind that lasts, needed more than one victory. She had opened a door, Now she had to hold it open long enough for others to step through. And now what remained was the final recognition. The courtroom was packed, standing room only, yet not a single person moved as the judge picked up the sheet of paper and began to read aloud. Months of investigation, weeks of public hearings, and decades of buried silence had all led to this moment. Logan Reed, the man who once strutted through courtrooms as if he owned them, now stood stiffly in a wrinkled suit, no longer in uniform, no longer shielded by a badge. The jury had returned a unanimous verdict, guilty on multiple counts, including obstruction of justice, abuse of authority under color of law, and falsification of official documents. The judge was firm but calm as he handed down the sentence: 12 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole before serving at least 9. Logan's face remained rigid, but Ava, watching from a reserved seat in the front row, noticed the slight twitch in his jaw, the clenched fists at his side. For the first time, he looked stripped of power, not because the law had found him guilty, but because the people watching believed he deserved it. Behind him, murmurs rippled through the crowd, some sighs of relief, some quiet gasps of disbelief, but no protest. The courtroom had become a stage for accountability, and, for once, the system did not look away. Across town at the city's police headquarters, a very different but equally significant scene had unfolded earlier that day. Richard Nolan, the man who had once warned Ava that she could be buried by the system, had walked out of his office for the last time. His resignation was not voluntary. An independent commission, led by federal oversight, had completed its audit and presented damning evidence: manipulation of departmental review processes, cover-ups of internal complaints, suppression of whistleblower reports, and illicit coordination with certain city officials to derail external investigations. Faced with potential federal charges and mounting public pressure, Nolan agreed to step down in exchange for immunity from prosecution. To some, it seemed like a soft ending for a man who had orchestrated so much behind the scenes, but Ava knew better. His name was now forever tied to corruption, his legacy shredded not by political enemies, but by the truth. More importantly, his resignation opened the gates for broader reforms. Dozens of other officers, many named in Ava's files, were now under internal review. Some had been suspended, others demoted, and several faced ongoing criminal proceedings. But it was what happened next that marked a turning point in the city's history. At a press conference held on the courthouse steps just hours after Logan's sentencing, the city's interim police chief stood beside the mayor, the district attorney, and Ava Daniels herself. They issued a formal apology, not just words on a page, but a direct acknowledgement of the pain, the silence, and the injustice inflicted upon the community over the years. "We failed you," the chief said. "We failed to uphold the principles we swore to protect, and for that, we are sorry." The mayor followed, promising an overhaul of oversight procedures and a public release of past internal misconduct findings. But what truly struck the crowd, and what made the moment real, was that the apology didn't stop with officials. A group of officers, those not implicated but shaken by what they had witnessed, stood behind them in full uniform, not to defend the system but to bear witness to its failings. The gesture was not scripted, it wasn't political, it was human, and for the first time in the city's memory, the system bowed its head, not in shame alone, but in recognition of the people it had harmed. The image spread quickly across social media. Ava Daniels standing silently as the city that once tried to silence her publicly acknowledged its wrongs. The symbolism was powerful, but for Ava, it was never about symbols. The trials had closed, the sentences passed down, and the apologies spoken aloud, but none of it erased the lives already torn apart by the abuses that had been allowed to flourish. Justice, to her, was never about punishing a man like Logan or forcing someone like Nolan out of office. Justice was about ending the silence. It was about forcing a system to confront its reflection and admit what it had become. The courtroom's verdict was necessary, but it was not the end. It was only the moment when the machinery of denial finally cracked under the weight of truth. And while many in the media focused on the spectacle of sentencing, Ava knew the real work had always been bigger than one man in cuffs or one title stripped away. She had stood not for vengeance but for exposure, not for revenge but for clarity. And now, with the system's hand forced into acknowledgement, she saw something even more powerful beginning to take shape. Public trust, once shattered, slowly trying to rebuild itself. Community centers began holding open forums with law enforcement. Independent oversight boards expanded their reach. Youth mentorship programs funded by Ava's Justice Reform Initiative saw record enrollment. And perhaps most telling, young black and brown students began writing essays not just about injustice, but about what justice might look like if they were the ones shaping it. The verdict was necessary. The resignations were overdue. But for Ava Daniels, the victory she cared most about was never tied to a sentence or a press conference. It was what came after. It was the feeling, faint but real, that perhaps, finally, the people were no longer afraid to demand more from the systems built to serve them. But for Ava, the true victory was something else entirely. Ava Daniels stood by the window of her office, the late afternoon light casting a golden hue across the city that once tried to break her. The courtroom battles were over. The laws were passed. The names had been called, and the verdicts delivered. But Ava understood something deeper. Justice wasn't just an outcome. It was a path. And the journey down that path didn't end when the gavel dropped or the headlines faded. It continued. Every single day, in every silent choice people made to either speak out or remain quiet. As she looked out over Charleston, she didn't see just the buildings or the traffic or the city skyline. She saw the faces of the people who had come forward, who had broken their silence because someone else showed them it was possible. She saw the mother who used to whisper her son's story behind closed doors, now speaking at community forums. She saw young law students who had watched her hearings online deciding to study civil rights law, determined to rewrite a system they had grown up fearing. She saw teachers integrating justice literacy into their lesson plans, pastors reshaping sermons around truth and accountability, teenagers forming peer justice groups in high schools. She saw momentum, not for her, but for something much bigger. The work Ava had done was never about making herself a hero. It was about building a crack in something massive, something old, something designed to stay unchallenged. And once the crack formed, light began to pour in. She wasn't the only one anymore. In Detroit, a young organizer launched a campaign demanding similar interrogation transparency. In Phoenix, a local council passed a resolution to release officer disciplinary records. In New Jersey, a former prosecutor cited the Ava Daniels Act as the reason she resigned and joined a nonprofit helping wrongly convicted youth. None of these names would make the evening news. But Ava knew they mattered just as much as her own. What started as her battle had now become a shared movement. One by one, across the country, people began asking harder questions. They stopped accepting easy answers. They stopped being afraid of being inconvenient. And that shift, that cultural shift, was the victory Ava had always hoped for. Even when she thought she was losing, she returned to her seat and opened a letter that had arrived that morning. It was handwritten, shaky in places, clearly from someone older. A retired teacher from Alabama had written her to say thank you, not for the trial, not for the law, but for showing her that silence doesn't protect the innocent. It protects the system. Ava smiled quietly, folded the letter and placed it into the growing stack of messages she kept in her drawer, not as trophies, but as reminders. Reminders of why she started, why she stayed, and why she would never stop. Because power didn't scare her anymore. Silence did. A soft knock came at the door. It was one of her interns, a 21-year-old political science major who had been too nervous to speak on their first day but now coordinated local outreach events. "The community board meeting starting," they said. Ava nodded, grabbed her coat, and followed. There was no grand finale, no camera crew waiting outside, just another room of ordinary people trying to do the extraordinary thing of fixing what others had left broken. As she took her seat and looked around at the circle of people, students, elders, activists, public defenders, she didn't feel tired. She felt ready. Ready for the next fight. Ready for the next uncomfortable conversation. Ready for the next truth that needed to be spoken out loud. Justice, she had learned, was not a gift handed down by those in power. It was the result of unrelenting courage, the kind that refuses to be silenced, the kind that chooses discomfort over complicity, the kind that doesn't stop just because the cameras have. Ava Daniels had become a symbol not because she had all the answers, but because she had asked the questions others were too afraid to speak. She had stared down the system, not as someone invincible, but as someone unwilling to look away. That was her legacy, not in stone, not in headlines, but in every person who saw her and realized they didn't have to be quiet anymore. That's what justice really was. Not just trials or laws or policy, but the fire inside people who refused to forget what they had seen. That fire could spread, and it had. As the meeting began and Ava listened to a young woman explain her plan to launch a citywide audit initiative, she smiled, not because she was proud of herself, but because she saw that the future was already moving forward. She didn't need to lead it anymore. She just needed to protect the space it needed to grow. The story had begun with a slap. It had moved through silence, defiance, exposure, and reform. But it ended here, quietly, with a room full of voices rising, not in outrage, but in clarity. They knew the system could not be trusted to fix itself, so they would keep showing up, again and again, until it had no choice but to change. Ava knew she had done what she came to do, not finish the work, but make sure it could never be ignored again. And that's when she truly understood what she had been fighting for all along. Justice does not come from power. It comes from courage that refuses to yield. The story you've just witnessed isn't fiction in spirit. It's a reflection of the real battles happening every day in courtrooms, communities, and quiet corners where people like Ava Daniels decide they've had enough. Her journey began with one act of violence in a room designed for justice, but it grew into something far more powerful, a movement shaped by silence, resistance, and ultimately, unshakable courage. Ava didn't start with power. She started with truth, and by standing firm when the world expected her to fall, she uncovered a truth too many systems had buried, that the strongest change never comes from the top, it rises from the refusal to back down. Her story echoes because we've all seen a version of it before, in our neighborhoods, in the headlines, in the stories people whisper about but never dare to say aloud. We've seen institutions protect themselves, protect each other, while the vulnerable are left outside. We've seen evidence disappear, voices silenced, and lives rewritten by unchecked authority. But what Ava's story reminds us is that courage disrupts that cycle. It doesn't just expose what's broken, it demands that we all see it too. From the moment she walked into that courtroom, Ava refused to play the role that had been written for her. She wasn't there to be passive or polite or part of the system's routine. She was there to confront the weight of injustice with something that couldn't be erased, presence. And even when she was struck, literally, publicly, she didn't strike back with violence. She answered with silence, with investigation, with the law, and ultimately, with leadership that couldn't be bought or broken. That is what made the difference. She didn't dismantle the system overnight, but she weakened it in the one place it had never been vulnerable before. Belief. Belief that it was untouchable, that no one would challenge it, that silence would protect it forever. Through Ava's relentless pursuit of truth, the people watching began to believe something else, that justice was not a fantasy but a fight that could be won. Slowly, quietly, and then loudly, that belief spread. In classrooms, in court filings, in city halls, in dinner conversations where someone said, "Did you hear what happened in Charleston?" And every time that belief moved, the old order shook. Because systems don't collapse when laws change. They collapse when people stop being afraid of them. Ava didn't want to be a hero. She wanted to be heard. And now, thanks to her, thousands more voices are following. That is the legacy that matters. Not the courtroom battles, not the legislation, but the shift in what we're willing to accept. So now we pass the question on to you. In your world, your city, your circle, what truth are you willing to stand up for, even if your voice shakes? We want to know. Comment below with what part of Ava's story moved you the most, or share your thoughts on how real change begins. Your voice matters here. And if this story inspired you, challenged you, or even just made you pause and think, don't keep it to yourself. Hit the like button, share this story with someone who needs it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that don't just entertain, but awaken. Because justice doesn't come wrapped in perfection, it comes wrapped in persistence, in ordinary people choosing, again and again, to do the difficult thing. Ava Daniels taught us that. Now it's our turn to carry it forward. Her fight may be done, but ours is just beginning.